Thank you, Lonnie, for the beautiful introduction, but even more importantly for... am I on now? My green light is on. Can someone turn... Can people hear me in the back now? Okay, good. So, thank you for that very warm introduction, Lonnie, but more importantly, thank you for the extraordinary opportunities that you provide for this community. It's really, I love Madison, but I wish you lived in Madison. You're all incredibly fortunate to be the beneficiaries. I'm here tonight for just a brief time. Let me just begin by asking, how many people were here for my 4 o'clock presentation? Okay, good, wonderful. So I'm not going to say anything I said at 4 o'clock. I want to begin actually with a theme that Lonnie introduced in her wonderfully rich autobiographical description of her own journey. We are all endowed with an extraordinary brain. One of the most extraordinary parts of our brain is this part in the front that we call the prefrontal cortex. If you look across evolution, across phylogeny, it turns out that the prefrontal cortex in humans is larger than in any other species if you correct for overall differences in brain volume and body weight. And there are certain parts of the prefrontal cortex which are especially disjunctive, so that if you look across species, the mass of these parts of the brain is just enormously increased. And many scientists believe that many of the qualities that we think of as being distinctively human come from the endowment that we have been conferred, at least in part, through the expanse of the prefrontal cortex. One of the extraordinary things that humans can do that other species have a much more difficult time doing is what we in the trade call time travel. What does time travel mean? It's the kind of thing that Lonnie was talking about. It's being able to reflect on the past and being able to anticipate the future. We can mentally project ourselves, both in the past and in the future, in a way that is very, very different than other species are able to do. We can retrieve memories from decades ago. We can imagine future scenarios that might occur decades away. These skills and competences provide obvious advantages for us as humans and enable us to do extraordinary things which our culture clearly exemplifies. But these competences also get us into trouble sometimes and enable us to ruminate about our past and to worry about the future and to not be here in the present in a way which is also different than in any other species. I think it's fair to say that the incidence of psychiatric disorder is much greater in humans than it is in any other species. And it's much greater in humans than it is in any other species because, in large part, we can do time travel. Because we have the capacity to anticipate the future and ruminate about the past. So these are skills which we can harness to our advantage, but they also are competences which can ensnare us and can detract from us being here in the present. This configuration of our brain is something that has fascinated me from the earliest time in my career, and I have been studying the prefrontal cortex and its role in our emotions and in our thoughts from the time I first began as a scientist. And one of the roles that the prefrontal cortex plays, which has only been discovered in real detail over the last decade or so, is our capacity to regulate our emotions and also to dysregulate our emotions. The book that I wrote, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, is a summary and a synthesis of 30 plus years of neuroscientific research that we've been doing. And that research has been greatly informed by new knowledge of the role of the prefrontal cortex and areas that are connected to the prefrontal cortex in emotion and emotion regulation. And in this book, I talk about 6 different emotional styles that emerge from our neuroscientific understanding. And these are not emotional styles of the sort that have been given to us by personality theories or by categories in psychiatry. They are emotional styles that directly come from our understanding of the brain. And I'd like to tell you, to describe these 6 emotional styles. I'll name all 6, and I'll give some more detail about a few of them. One style I call the resilience style. And the resilience style refers to how slowly or quickly we recover from adversity. Some people, when they encounter life slings and arrows, and it could be something major, but it also could be something minor. I mean, think of the last time you were stuck in an airport where a flight was canceled. Something that happens rather frequently these days, and just noticing your emotional reactions to that transient blockage of a goal. Some people, in response to even minor upsets of that sort, have a response which persists. They perseverate, and their negative emotion lasts for a period that's much longer than the event itself. Other people may respond with an appropriate emotion, have a momentary period of frustration, but then recover very, very quickly. So this style is describing the speed at which we recover from adversity. And it turns out that there are certain neural systems which play an enormously important role in shaping our position on this continuum of resilience. And this circuit is a circuit that includes the prefrontal cortex and its connections to areas in the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which regulate our capacity to recover from adversity. So that's one style. A second style is the outlook style, which in many ways is the flip side of resilience. And what outlook refers to is our capacity to sustain positive emotion. Now, some people, when they have, for example, a really warm-hearted conversation with a loved one in the morning, it puts a positive glow on their whole day. It's kind of inhaling something really nourishing, and it colors their whole day. Other individuals may have a very similar kind of interaction in the morning, and there is an experience of positive emotion, but it's very short-lived. It's transient, and a person would then come right back to baseline. In research that we've done, we found that people who are clinically depressed actually show an appropriate brain response when a positive incentive is presented. The neural circuits that are important for positive emotion actually activate. But what they don't do is they don't sustain that activation over time. And it turns out that the capacity to sustain that activation over time is really important for the preservation of well-being. And the circuit in the brain that is involved, again, involves the prefrontal cortex, but this time its connection to another brain region, which is called the ventral striatum, which we know is very important in certain kinds of positive emotion. The frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, this part up here, has connections to many, many different other brain regions. It's kind of a convergence zone where all of these inputs come and there are outputs that go back to these areas. So that's the second style. First is resilience, the second is outlook. A third style we call sensitivity to context. Now this is a weird one and not something you would read about in a typical popular psychology book. What this refers to is our capacity to modulate our emotional responses in a way that's appropriate for the context in which we find ourselves. So how you behave with your spouse is likely different than how you might behave at work or how you might behave with a boss. Those are contextual differences, and it's appropriate to modulate our emotional responses in a way that's appropriate to our context. If we're in a very familiar environment, we behave somewhat differently than if we're in a totally strange, novel environment. One of the ways in which we've learned about the context style is by studying individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is fundamentally a disorder of context. And what I mean by that is this. Individuals with PTSD have a very difficult time using context to modulate their emotional responses in an appropriate way. So a person with PTSD, say a veteran who's just come back from Afghanistan, may be walking in his neighborhood, which is a perfectly safe neighborhood, and an ambulance goes by. And the siren from the ambulance triggers a panic attack. And the situation is such that the individual with PTSD is not using the contextual information that this is a safe neighborhood, this is an ambulance, not using that information in a typical way to modulate emotional responses in a way which would be common to those of us, to most of us in this room. And the part of the brain which is importantly involved in this is the hippocampus, which is critical for context, and also the interaction between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So that's a third style, context. A fourth style is social intuition. And what we mean by social intuition is your ability to pick up on the nonverbal cues of emotion of others, to pick up on their emotional cues, on their vibes. How are vibes communicated? They're communicated through facial expression, through bodily posture, person's demeanor, their vocal expressions, all of these nonverbal signals that exemplify a person's emotional state. The ability to pick up on these cues varies across individuals and is critical for optimal emotional functioning. The way we've learned most about this particular style is by studying children on the autism spectrum. Kids on the autism spectrum have a very difficult time, at least a significant subset of them, picking up on these nonverbal cues. And nonverbal cues which are quite neutral or even highly positive, like a mother's face, are processed by the brain as if they're threat signals. And so individuals on the autism spectrum will often show gaze aversion. They won't look at a face with eye contact. And the gaze aversion actually helps them reduce uncomfortable levels of arousal, but it also has the side effect of decreasing their ability to pick up on these nonverbal cues of emotion. And we know that healthy social interaction critically depends upon the rapid decoding of these nonverbal cues. So that's a fourth emotional style. Fifth is what we call self-awareness. And what self-awareness refers to is the ability to monitor your own emotional cues. Now, that may seem a little odd, but it turns out that we can actually show emotions of many different kinds and actually not be very aware of the emotions that are happening in our bodies and in our minds. Yet we can show in the laboratory, as well as in everyday experience, that those emotions are actually having significant effects on oneself as well as on those around us. So this fifth emotional style is self-awareness, and it primarily refers to how accurate or inaccurate we are in picking up our own bodily cues which reflect emotion. And there are ways of objectively measuring this. And one part of the brain which is critically involved in this is a part directly connected to the prefrontal cortex, and it's a part of the brain that I did talk about at 4 o'clock in the context of some meditation research, and it's a part of the brain called the insula. And the insula is a really interesting part of the brain because it's the only part of the brain that has a map of all of the visceral organs in the body. It allows the brain to monitor the body and also allows the brain to send signals down to the body to modulate the body in emotional situations. And again, people vary in where they fall along this continuum of self-awareness. With each of these emotional styles, we all have all of them, but we differ. Each person differs in where she or he falls on each of these dimensions. So I've told you about 5 so far. To review, I've told you about the resilience style, the outlook style, the context style, the social intuition style, and the self-awareness style. The last style, the 6th style, is attention. Now, attention is normally not thought of as a part of emotion, and yet attention is an intimate part of emotion because we attend to things that are emotional. Our attention is captured by emotionally salient things in our environment. And some of us are really focused in our attention and can direct our attention quite voluntarily. Others of us are much more scattered and we are distracted. And we've learned about this style in part by studying individuals with attention deficit disorders. We've also learned about this style by studying people who have very good attention and who've engaged in practices like meditation, which can strengthen attention. So these are the 6 emotional styles. We all, again, differ in how we fall on each of these dimensions, and when you put all 6 together, it tells you something important about a person's emotional balance and their emotional disposition. Now, one of the cool things about this area of research is that we've learned that the circuits in the brain that are important for each of these emotional styles exhibit what we call plasticity. Plasticity or neuroplasticity simply means that the brain can change in response to experience or in response to training. Our brains are constantly being shaped by the forces around us. Most of the time, our brains are being shaped unwittingly. We're kind of like a sailboat in the middle of an ocean on a very windy day, but a sailboat that's rudderless, being pushed and pulled by the wind as it whirls. Cultivating intentional qualities through certain kinds of mental training can enable us to modulate and to introduce a rudder in a way that can actually change these emotional styles. So each one of these 6 emotional styles is rooted in a circuit that we know is plastic. And we can actually change our emotional styles in ways that can make them more optimal. So the second part of my book is really about the transformation of emotional styles and the notion that we can take responsibility for our own brains and we can transform these emotional styles in ways that can promote well-being. And in fact, we've been led to the conclusion that happiness and well-being are skills. Happiness and well-being are skills. We don't ordinarily think about them as skills. But all of the evidence leads us to this inevitable conclusion. We can actually become happier people. We can cultivate higher levels of well-being by taking intentional responsibility for the cultivation of more positive mental habits, which will then change our brains in specific ways that involve the circuits that I alluded to in my description of these emotional styles. And I've been blessed in my life. I did mention this at 4 o'clock, so there will be a slight amount of repetition, but I've been blessed by an amazing relationship with the Dalai Lama, who first invited me to meet with him in 1992. And he's been an amazing inspiration to underscore the value of studying healthy qualities of mind and also using secular methods that are derived from the contemplative traditions to train our minds so that we can transform our emotional habits and through that practice to also change our brains. And so there are specific practices that can be gleaned from these contemplative traditions that can help us become more resilient. They can improve our outlook. They can improve our capacity for self-awareness, for tuning into the social signals of others, and for improving our attention. And so these are all exercises, if you will, mental exercises, which can lead to strengthening of these circuits, changes in our emotional behavior. But the other amazing thing is that many of these circuits are intimately connected with our bodies, with our immune systems, with our endocrine systems, and with our autonomic nervous systems. We know today that happiness is associated with better physical health. The data on that score are incontrovertible at this point in time. What we don't know is the mechanisms through which that association arises. Some of those mechanisms, though, likely have to do with the interaction between the circuits in the brain that I'm alluding to and the immune and endocrine and autonomic nervous systems. We've been doing studies in our center that involve certain physical diseases where there's incontrovertible evidence that psychosocial stress plays a role in exacerbating those disorders. And there's a whole laundry list of those disorders that exact an enormous burden in our society. Disorders of inflammation, for example, including cardiovascular disease, asthma, diabetes. These are disorders which have huge consequences and cost an enormous amount of money. The financial burden on our culture is enormous. These are all disorders where we know that psychosocial stress can exacerbate the symptoms of the illness. If psychosocial stress can make things worse, that means that stuff from the environment gets under our skin. The way it gets under our skin is through our brain. And if there's stuff out there that can make things worse, if we change our brains, we can make things better. And there are data now to show that we can actually influence the course of some of these illnesses by modulating these circuits through simple behavioral exercises that come from contemplative traditions. So I believe that it may be the case that we can actually decrease healthcare costs by all taking more responsibility for our own minds and brains through these simple kinds of practices. And if this is established empirically, and I don't want to oversell the data at this point, there's a smidgen of evidence to suggest that this may be true. There's a lot more that's needed. But if this is true, every corporation in America, every corporation in the world is going to want to be part of this, because there's a significant fraction of budgets which are used for healthcare costs. And it will also improve employee productivity, because there'll be less absenteeism, increased productivity, less mind wandering. All of these things which I think can make a huge difference. If you go back to the 1950s and you look at the percentage of people in this country who engaged in regular physical exercise as part of their weekly routine, it's a much smaller fraction than exists today. It's still today not a huge percentage of the population, but there's been an enormous increase from 1950 to now. That increase is due, at least in part, to the accruing scientific evidence that physical exercise plays an important role in our health and is good for us. I believe that mental exercise will have the same status as physical exercise in 20 years from now. That the evidence will be in hand that the regular practice of these mental exercises to achieve emotional balance will be as important as physical exercise. We have classes in schools these days for physical education. There will be a time, and it's starting now, where we'll have classes for mental education to improve children's abilities to pay attention, to improve their well-being, to improve their capacity to pick up on social signals of others, which is going to decrease bullying. These are all trainable skills, and we can begin young, and the brain is more plastic in those ages, and I think there's an enormous opportunity. So let me end my formal remarks by simply inviting you to explore more and to leave you with the suggestion and the invitation that we can all take more responsibility for our well-being, and it doesn't take much. And one of the best ways of improving our well-being is to be kind toward others. And reminding ourselves of that and engaging in those acts is something that is within each of our reach, and I invite you all to do that on a regular basis. So let me end here, and Lonnie is going to come up and bring the others on stage. So thank you all very much.
Andrew, are you up there, Andrew? We're going to do the 2 labs on the 2 other guys. And Richie, maybe while we're transitioning, why don't you tell them about the Free the Mind documentary?
Be happy to. Thank you for the request, Lonnie. I was contacted a number of years ago cold contacted by a documentary filmmaker in Denmark who said she heard me speak a couple of times and wants to do a documentary film about some of our work. And we get these requests periodically, and there's a knee-jerk response to say thank you, but no thank you. But there was something about the way she asked, and she said she'd like to fly from Copenhagen to Madison to spend an hour talking to me. So I said, fine. So she came and met with me, and she really is a quite remarkable woman, and the outcome of that is a documentary, a full-length documentary called Free the Mind, which hopefully will be coming to theaters near you. We're having the United States premiere on May 3rd in New York City. It will be then premiered in Madison, Wisconsin on May 15th, the day the Dalai Lama is visiting, and then hopefully it will be more widely distributed. So you can learn more about the documentary by going on our website, investigatinghealthyminds.org. Thank you.
I saw Richie speak in, I think it was October, November, when you were in Northbrook. He was at a private event, and I was privileged to see a short trailer of the movie. It's just astounding, beautiful film. I only wish that it had already premiered so we could have also done a little hand-in-hand screening of the movie while he was here, but the timing doesn't work. But I really encourage you when it does come. I think they may be looking at June for a screening in Chicago near the end of June. I want to double check. Carter and Eric, can you two check that your mics are working?
Peas and carrots. Peas
You're
and
good?
carrots.
Carter, how about you? All right, you have here in front of you, this gentleman right here on your left is Carter Cast. The other gentleman here is Eric Langshire. Carter Cast is a clinical professor teaching innovation and entrepreneurship at the Kellogg Graduate School of Management at Northwestern University, and he's a venture partner at New World Ventures. Eric Langshire, on the far on your right, is a co-founder of Abundant Venture Partners. Their professional biographies are long, accomplished. They have done many, many, many incredible things. Both of them said, let's not have to review all of that stuff. You can find them online really easily if you're curious about, well, what exactly have these two guys done? They've done quite a bit. I met Carter Cast this past January in the psychology section of Barnes & Noble in Evanston. It was actually the day of the regional science Olympiad tournament. My son competes in science Olympiad. There he is. Eno. He got second in state this past weekend, 6th grade. So we went down to the pump room and we had dinner and we come up. A good night for us is we go out to eat and then we buy books. That's how we have fun at our house. So we were upstairs in the psychology section, and Carter was there with his wife, who at the time was very pregnant, about 6 minutes from breaking water. I was like, oh my God, she's gonna have the baby right here. Lovely woman, and they were standing next to me, and I heard her say, I think it's spelled C-A-I-N. And I whipped my head around. I said, Susan Cain? Susan Cain? Because Susan Cain, I met Carter on January 19th. Susan Cain came January 31st for FAN. So I think I might have even had a flyer in my purse, because that's kind of how I am. So I said, oh, it's right here, because I had just seen it. And she goes, oh, thanks. I said, you like Susan Cain? So that started a conversation, as you might imagine. I said, oh, fan, Susan Cain. So I helped him locate Susan Cain's book on the shelf and then told him that she was speaking for FAN. A few days later, it took about 5 minutes of conversation to determine that our bookshelves had been separated at birth. At one point, he said to me, well, there's this great researcher in Madison doing incredible work if you're thinking about bringing in somebody about mindfulness and science. And I said, ha, Richie Davidson. He's FAN's April 25th speaker, to which he said, ha, I was at his lab 2 weeks ago. And I said, oh. I knew I was in like Flint when he gave me not his Kellogg email, but his personal email. I said, oh. I made it through the thing of like, here, yeah, call me, yeah, contact me on my website. So I made it through the first layer of penetration, and then about 6 minutes later I said, hey, Carter. I had this idea in that moment, talking to Carter, because I remember saying to him, aren't you kind of odd there over at Kellogg? Because he's saying, well, and have you read? And I said, yeah, but what are you reading that for? So it was very interesting that he was interested in a lot of things I was interested in. He was interested in mindfulness and meditation and all these things. And I said, do they know this about you over there at Kellogg? They let you... And of course, we were also doing several programs. Liz Gerber, who's a good friend of Carter's that I later found out, so that was another layer of interaction. We did our innovators panel here in this room a couple weeks ago with the 3 teens practically under the age of 24. So we were looking a lot about innovation and entrepreneurship, and then so there was all of a sudden, as you might, just this cascade, I kind of get in these states where I'm like, all the dominoes are falling into place. I said, Carter. So we became very simpatico very quickly, and he said, and I said, I have this idea, how about, I'm doing this Richie Davidson program, what if you were to somehow, let's figure out how we can incorporate, I like this whole idea of like compassionate commerce, yeah, about like how you can do well and still get rich, like how can you care about people and still have money, is that possible? Well, yeah, it is actually possible. And so he said, sounds great, I'm in, count me in, but you really have to meet my friend Eric. I said, okay, who's Eric? And he said, well, Eric. And it turns out that Eric and Carter had gone together to Richie's lab in Madison. So I was like, well, look at that. And I said, well, hey, you venture people want to venture some cash my way. I don't get paid a salary, so it's not like there's a lot of overhead. And we'll have a more serious conversation about that for next year. And feel free to say, Eric, give her some cash. In accepting my invitation to shape tonight's program, Carter circled in his friend Eric Langshire, who had been in close contact with Richie for some time. These guys are going to talk first. Eric and I think Carter are going to first kind of run a conversation for a little bit. They're going to talk about emotionally intelligent leadership in the corporate world, the power of mental training, and the pleasure of doing well while doing good. So my pleasure, Carter, Eric, and of course Richie, who you now know.
Thank you, Lonnie. Can you hear me all right? Great. So, Lonnie, I'm getting calibrated to you. I don't know if you saw just before we came on, Lonnie walked over to us, pulled out her finger. This was the motivational talk. Pulled out her finger and said, "You guys better be good." And so, Lonnie, we will try not to disappoint. But I actually think it's hard to disappoint when we're up here with you, Dr. Davidson. Something that you said that I just love. It's the optimism, the core optimism in the message that happiness and well-being is a skill that can be learned. So it's just really a privilege and an honor to be up here with you today, Richie. So thank you for joining us at FAN. Carter and I have been thinking about, in the context of answering the mail here for FAN and Lonnie, this whole idea of mindfulness in the workplace, mindfulness in leadership. So Carter, let me toss the question to you. What is a mindful leader?
I'll take one piece of it because I'm sure we're all going to have different. I feel like I'm in San Francisco and the trawler's coming in behind me.
It might be me.
Wait, Carter, I'm not sure if you're on. Are you on?
I think so. Maybe I'm just not talking in it enough.
Yeah,
How's that?
If it gets too disruptive, let's switch to the handhelds. Okay, so I'll put them by you guys. If it keeps going, it's kind of like a Doppler effect. You can just take it now. Yeah. Turn the other one off. I think you might be. I don't know which one of you is bugging.
Hello? Hello?
Sorry.
Hello? Yeah, there you go. Okay. Sorry. I'll take one piece of it because I think there's probably a lot we can expound on together. But in my experience at work, working for some horrible leaders and working for some terrific leaders, some of the traits that, one in particular that I've tried to model, that I've learned from in watching some of the really fine executives and I was at PepsiCo and I was at Walmart and I was at Electronic Arts, and so I've been at these big organizations that have had some really fine leaders. I think Richie called one of them the sensitivity to context, which modulating your emotional response in the context you're in. I think some of the really good mindful leaders, or just good leaders, period, have an ability to create space between the events that are occurring in the room and their response to the events. The Stoics would say maybe Marcus Aurelius would say equanimity, the ability to listen and observe and create distance between your visceral reaction emotionally and then what you decide to say. So that sort of impulse control. And that's something that I've tried to work on because I'm by nature a very impulsive person, which in some ways serves me well, I think, but in some ways, as I was getting in positions of more responsibility and there were more issues that were coming across my desk, served me poorly. So meditating and practicing mindfulness by realizing that a thought is just a passing cloud, and I have the ability to let the thought come, accept it, let it pass, and then make my comment. So I think that ability to sort of create space is one aspect, I think, of a good mindful leader. I'm sure there's many more we could talk about, but that's the first one that comes to mind because it's kind of a personal issue that I've faced over the years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about it the same way. When I think about great leaders, kind of the textbook.
Use the other one.
Is this on? Good. All right, yeah. So the textbook would say great leaders set direction, enlist people to the cause, enable people to get stuff done, to get work done, and then communicating the entire way along. I think that all of that is true, but when, to build on your thought of spaciousness, I think there's a dimension of integrity that's at work in kind of the mindful leader kind of domain. And Gandhi talked about integrity as being when what you think and what you say and what you do are in harmony. And it's such a simple yet incredibly powerful idea. And actually an idea that we at my business kind of baked into our kind of everyday process. So we take for our portfolio companies, we go through a process where we define purpose and go through a purpose exercise with for almost 2 full days with the companies. And what we do is we go off-site and spend time and really deep conversation trying to define the soul of the business, trying to define what is the dream of the company, what do we stand for, what are our beliefs, what are our values, what are our attributes and the spirit of the organization, what is our greatest imaginable challenge, and what is our focus. And a really interesting thing comes of that exercise, and we've seen this over and over, is during the course of doing business, during the course of the day-to-day with each of these companies, we kind of live in ambiguity, right? So many decisions are made where the lines are blurry between what the right thing to do is or what the wrong thing to do is, or how we should make a decision. There's often these shades of gray. And when we have the purpose work done and kind of living as a living tool in the company, what it does is it lets everybody line up behind what the company's all about and be in integrity with what the company's all about. And we actually find that to be just an incredibly effective tool, and hear it all the time from just about everybody. I think the second dimension is one that I'm working on personally, and it's really a shift. It's a shift from a commitment to being right to I think almost a radical posture of curiosity. So I was very anchored in a commitment to being right and having the answers and having the point of view and being the go-to guy with the strong opinion. And my shift these days is really to just a different orientation. As Carter, you were saying, more of a spaciousness, to ask the question, what can I learn from this situation? And you can just imagine in the context of something going wrong. It's probably an easy example. So something goes wrong. So rather than take a point of view of trying to figure out who's to blame for the thing that's going wrong, just ask a different question. It's like, what can we learn, and how can we create a little space in this, and what can we learn about the systems, what can we learn about the environment, what can we learn about how we interacted, and for all of us, and especially me, to work in that environment with that as a posture of just pure curiosity, it's freeing, and it's a safe place to be. And it really lets people show initiative, it lets people engage, it lets people be creative, and it just really redefines the workplace. So Richie, my interest in the question for you, especially with your close relationship with the Dalai Lama, is the ultimate mindful leader. How would you characterize his mindful leadership style?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think I would say that It's certainly, his style incorporates elements that both of you have suggested. I think that clearly he has an extraordinary attitude of curiosity. His most frequent response to a question is, "I don't know," and let's investigate. And then it's often followed by some more probing. I think that in the Dalai Lama there is, you really have the palpable sense of complete alignment, which is always wonderfully present. Another thing about, as a student of emotion, I've been intensely curious about the Dalai Lama, as he has taught me so much about emotion, and his dynamic range of emotion is greater than any human being with whom I've ever interacted. We know, how many of you in the audience are parents? Okay. So as a parent, you know, during the time of infancy, that an infant can go from a state of being hysterically crying to a state of hysterically laughing just like that. That's something that we have all lost. We have all lost that capacity. Infants have that capacity. The Dalai Lama has that capacity. He can go from, I've seen it, from crying out of sadness, with tears down his face, and literally instantaneously just burst out laughing. The dynamic range of emotion is extraordinary. And that is because he has this incredible capacity for recovery. It's just the emotions arise and then they come right back down. They're gone.
Is that resilience?
Yes, that is resilience. And poof, they're totally gone. I think for a leader, one of the things which seems to me to be to get in the way of good leadership is when emotions linger beyond the point where they're useful, and then they can be really toxic. His emotions are just totally appropriate for the situation, and then they're gone. So it's a kind of one of the things we talk about in our lab is stickiness, and I think that the absence of stickiness is a mark of a really effective leader in terms of the leader's emotional style. The Dalai Lama is someone who just, has no stickiness.
Can I ask you one that's I think it's hard for me, and I think it's probably hard for most people in this room. We talk about mindfulness, we read about it, and I think a lot of us equate it with almost a non-achievement ethos. So can you reconcile being mindful and also being achievement-oriented?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Carter, a really important question. And in fact, there was someone who came up to me from the last period and asked a very similar question one-on-one. And my own view is that they're not inconsistent at all. And in fact, the life of the Dalai Lama, as well as the life of other, in my 4 o'clock talk, I talked a little bit about Mathieu Ricard, a monk who has been a subject in our lab, and who spends at least 3 or 4 months a year in solitary retreat. And for the other 8 or 9 months, he gets done what the average person might do in 36 months. He's just so utterly on task and productive. And his passion and his commitments have, if anything, been strengthened by the practice, not diminished. And so I think that the difference is not being so hung up and attached to the outcomes. So really still having the drive and the motivation, but if things don't work out for whatever reason, not being totally jangled by that, and being able to navigate through obstacles when they occur.
What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, that's a hard answer to top, Richie. I actually almost reject the premise of the question. That I don't think we have the luxury of choosing one or the other, and then it's an and. So it's just not an either or. And we don't, unlike Thoreau, right? We don't have the luxury of disappearing into the woods for a couple of years and 2 months. And that this idea of being and doing need to coexist. And achievement is baked into our wiring for happiness. So Martin Seligman, one of the founders or fathers of positive psychology, revised his theory of authentic happiness after years to include achievement as as one of the elements that are important to us. And I think it's kind of wired. And my meditation teacher, a guy named S.A. Goenka, he talked about his philosophy of mindfulness as incorporating really 3 elements. So realism, optimism, and workism. So realism, I accept things as they are. I am okay with what is. Optimism, I can see the good and I can see the potential. But this idea of workism, of asking the question, just as you described with Mathieu Ricard, like now what needs to be done, and engage. And in fact, I had just a crazy experience on a 10-day silent meditation retreat, which was perhaps actually hands down the hardest thing I've ever done. And no talking, which was the easy part. No reading, no writing, no exercise, no food afternoon. And so by day 1, 2, 3 were brutal, but by day 4, the incessant chatter that has accompanied me my entire life just started to calm down. You talk, Richie, I love the metaphor of the sail, the rudderless sailboat just kind of flapping. The mental clarity that set in, I didn't even know what mental clarity was. I mean, I didn't even know that mental clarity was a thing. But just it felt like the reduction in thoughts and the ability to be focused and present and hyper-focused. And as a consequence, the amount of energy that was released, I mean, all the energy that I spend, my normal day-to-day. And I love the way you put it, Richie, reminiscing about the past and anticipating the future. I would probably characterize it as regretting the past and worrying about the future. And so to translate that energy into something just more productive is incredible. So when you say, Mathieu Ricard doing more in 8 months than people can do in 36, I now understand that.
Productive's a funny word, isn't it? It can be a dangerous word if we equate it with the punch list and just pop through the day. You talked about your 6th style. You mentioned attention and focus, and how meditation can help you with focus. And your research has shown it without a doubt that people have improved focus, and they pick up on the numbers and the sequences and a lot of really interesting research. That misnomer to me that you're good at multitasking. You're an excellent multitasker. Pop, 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 pop. Land war on multiple fronts. Pop, pop, pop. And I kind of reject that notion. I think it's so much more important to have this deliberate, deep examination of a topic, and when you're in the middle of something, absorbing yourself in that and and taking that focus and really honing in on that, and not answering the phone, and not looking, not when the email bing goes off, ignoring it. That to me seems really what we're talking about. And one of the guys, if you want a really good author, has anybody read David Whyte, Whyte? Yeah, a bunch of people, a Welsh poet who goes into corporations and talks about poetry and soul inside the corporation. And he talks about being deliberate a lot. And that productivity word sometimes makes me a little worried that, we're talking about how quickly can you accomplish things on multiple fronts instead of sort of breathing in deeply a topic area.
So, Richie, in your book, you talk about your being a closet meditator for a lot of your life. Can you tell us about coming out of the closet?
Well, I told the story in my 4 o'clock talk a little bit, but Eric mentioned his teacher Goenka. Goenka was actually my first teacher, and my very first meditation retreat was with Goenka in 1974, and one of these 10-day retreats, which are the standard kind of Goenka retreats. And that, as it does for many people, had a very powerful effect on me, and I came back to the United States. They weren't taught in the United States at that time. They are now. But I came back with such a strong sense that this was really important for Western psychology and neuroscience to put their arms around. And I was kind of shocked. I was so naive at that point. I was one of these kids that, I graduated from high school when I was 16. I graduated from college when I was 20, and I had my Ph.D. when I was 24. When I went to India for the first time, I was 22 years old, and I came back and, just naively thought that people would embrace this, and it was tough. It was really tough in those days. Very lonely, and I really the closet meditator phrase, it was very intentionally chosen because I didn't feel safe talking about it. I felt that I would be so judged by my colleagues.
Has it changed? To what extent has it changed?
I think it's changed dramatically. I mean, certainly I'm in a very different position in my career, but it's changed. It's really changed. I mean, I could never have envisioned that the Dalai Lama would be invited to talk to the Society for Neuroscience. It's the most prestigious organization of neuroscientists in the world. I mean, that's crazy. I just never would have dreamt that would have happened from the experiences I had in the early part of my career. I never dreamt that journals like the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences would be publishing research reports on meditation. I never dreamt that, now I see job ads. I just saw an ad recently for an academic position at Carnegie Mellon University where they advertised in the job ad for someone interested in mindfulness.
But Richie, why isn't it going faster?
Well, I think it's going faster. I think there are converging influences. One is that neuroscience discovered neuroplasticity, and that gives an intellectual framework for understanding how meditation might work. And there's been a parallel change in biology with epigenetics. We now understand that genes can be regulated, they're not fixed. And there's plasticity in genetics as well. And so that's been a total sea change in terms of the biological sciences. And the accruing empirical evidence is now fairly substantial in showing that there's a there there. And so, I can talk to institute directors about this. We have a meeting coming up in Dharamsala, India, at the Dalai Lama's residence in October, and it's on craving and addiction. And the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, one of the NIH institutes, is coming. I mean, that would be unheard of even 5 years ago. So there really, I think, has been an important change.
So this is probably, when I think of meditation, before I started meditating, I thought of it as, a long period of time and very, very specific rules, all of the typical things you've heard when you were, for non-meditators. But to have efficacy, what do you to see the results from neurotransmitters and neural pathways and increased attention, and how much do you have to do? I know you get this question all the time, but it's good for the audience to hear. How much do you have to do, and are there different ways to do it? Can I do it walking along the lake?
Yeah, so those are all wonderful questions, and probably the most honest answer I can give is something the Dalai Lama says a lot. We don't know. But more seriously, there are a few things we can say. One is that even short amounts of practice make a difference. I talked at 4 o'clock about a study that was coming out from our lab very, very soon in the next couple of weeks, which shows that 2 weeks of 30 minutes a day of practice, of a compassion meditation practice, actually changes the brain. So it's a total of 7 hours of practice. So that's just one empirical data point. Probably even less than that can show an effect. Now, whether it's not going to be an effect that will, quote, last unless you keep practicing. I'm often asked that question too. Well, how much do you need to really make a change, expecting that the change will be permanent? If someone was physically out of shape and they went to a 2-week exercise program and they actually derived considerable benefit from that 2 weeks, but then stopped doing physical exercise for the rest of their life, no one would think that the effects would persist for very long, and I think the same is true for mental practice. So I do think that short amounts of practice can make a difference. The second part of your question was about where can it be done in the context, and fundamentally, meditation is about awareness. That, in terms of the bottom line, that's what it's about. It's about awareness. And it can be done anywhere. It can be done anytime. It doesn't have to be done in a special posture. It doesn't have to be done on a cushion. It can be done anywhere. It's really fundamentally about awareness. And in the original Sanskrit, the word meditation means familiarization. And one of the things that we learn from the texts in these traditions is that what meditation really is about familiarizing ourselves with our own awareness. And the practice is not so much about learning something new, it's about becoming familiar with something that we've lost touch with.